The bell above the diner door jingled as a man stepped inside. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when sunlight slanted through dusty blinds and painted long golden lines across the floor. Most of the booths were half empty, a few families finishing their plates, a couple of teenagers laughing over milkshakes. It felt like just another ordinary day in this small-town diner until the stranger walked in. He moved slowly, but there was strength in his steps. His boots were worn, his jacket faded, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity. He was a black man, maybe in his 40s, his eyes sharp but tired, like someone who had seen too much. There was a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, heavy and full, the kind of bag that traveled with soldiers more than tourists. He walked to the counter and set it down carefully, as if the weight inside was not just cloth and metal, but years of stories too heavy to tell. The waitress noticed him right away. She was young, maybe 20, with her hair tied up and chewing gum between her teeth. She had been laughing with two other co-workers behind the counter, giggling about something on her phone. When she looked at the man, her smile didn't fade, it twisted. She exchanged a glance with her friend, a small smirk, as if this customer was a joke before he even spoke. "Coffee," the man said simply, his voice low, steady. The waitress leaned on the counter, gum snapping between her teeth. "Sure thing," she said, dragging her words out. She poured the coffee into a chipped white mug, but instead of setting it gently in front of him, she slid it down the counter like it was some bar game. The mug clattered to a stop inches from his hand, some of the dark liquid spilling over the side. The man didn't flinch. He just reached for a napkin, wiped the spill, and nodded politely. "Thank you." That only made the waitress laugh harder. Her friend leaned in, whispering something, and both burst into giggles. One of them said just loud enough for others to hear, "Guess he thinks he's still in uniform." Another snickered, "Look at that old bag, bet he sleeps in it." The man sat in silence, sipping his coffee. Around him, a few customers glanced over, uncomfortable. A mother with her little boy frowned but looked away quickly. Two men in a booth shifted uneasily but didn't speak. The air grew heavy, like everyone could feel something wrong was happening, but no one wanted to step into it. The waitress wasn't finished. She walked over with a menu in her hand, tapping it on the counter. "You want food too, soldier?" she asked, her tone sharp, mocking. "Or just coffee, since that's all the army gives you for dinner?" Her friends laughed again, the sound bouncing too loudly against the walls. The man's eyes lifted, calm but piercing. For a moment, the laughter faltered. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse, didn't fight. He just looked at her, steady as stone, and said, "Respect doesn't cost you anything." Then he lowered his gaze again, sipping the bitter coffee. That silence that followed was louder than all the laughter before it. The waitress blinked, her smirk slipping, but pride wouldn't let her back down. She turned away with a huff, muttering something under her breath. Minutes passed. The man finished his cup, set a few crumpled bills on the counter, and stood. The diner was still quiet as he picked up his duffel bag, swung it onto his shoulder, and walked to the door. His steps were heavy, but steady, his figure outlined against the fading sunlight outside. He paused just a second, as if sensing all the eyes watching him, and then pushed the door open. The bell jingled again, and he was gone. Only then did people begin to breathe again. The mother shook her head and whispered to her son, "That wasn't right." The two men in the booth stared at each other but said nothing. The waitress tried to laugh once more, but it sounded hollow this time, and nobody joined her. Outside, the veteran walked down the street slowly. His face was unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than anger. He had carried insults before, carried heavier weights than this, but inside, something stirred. Not for himself, he had faced worse, but for the town that chose silence over standing. The sun dipped lower, casting the street in orange light. His figure grew smaller as he walked toward the bus stop, just a man with a bag, disappearing into the evening. Back inside the diner, the laughter that had filled the air earlier felt like poison now. It clung to the walls, to the faces of those who had stayed quiet, to the waitress who tried to push away the guilt rising in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but that laugh would echo back at her louder than she could imagine. Because tomorrow, the whole town would know. Tomorrow, the diner would never be the same again. The morning after the incident, the diner opened as usual. Neon lights buzzed above the door, the smell of fried bacon and coffee drifting into the street. But something felt different. The air was not the same easy hum of small-town mornings. A shadow of last night's laughter still hung, and it was about to spread further than anyone in that diner could imagine. It began with a single phone screen. One of the teenagers sitting in the corner booth the night before had filmed everything: the laughter, the mocking words, the quiet veteran's calm reply. At first, it was just a short clip sent in a private group chat. But by dawn, it had traveled through more hands, more phones. The video landed on a local Facebook page, captioned with shaky anger, "This man fought for our country. This is how he was treated." Within an hour, the post had hundreds of comments. Some people wrote, "I was there. I saw it too." Others asked, "Who is he? Who was that man?" The clip was raw, blurry, but the truth inside it burned sharp. The sound of the waitress laughing, the quiet strength of the veteran's words, it hit harder than any speech could. By mid-morning, whispers filled the town. At the grocery store, two women leaned over their carts, whispering, "Did you see that video?" At the barbershop, old men shook their heads, muttering, "That's no way to treat a soldier." Even in the schoolyard, kids replayed the clip on their phones, pointing at the waitress's face and snickering, not with her, but at her. The diner owner, Mr. Carlson, didn't know any of this yet. He came in with his tie crooked and a newspaper under his arm. He poured himself coffee, sat in his office, and thought about bills and food orders. Business had been tough, but he believed nothing could break his diner. It had stood for 20 years. He didn't hear the whispers outside his walls. But the waitress heard. When she came in for her shift, she noticed the stares. Customers looked at her differently, some cold, some pitying. Her co-workers weren't laughing with her anymore. The cook in the back said nothing as she tied her apron. Even her friend from last night avoided her eyes. She brushed it off, told herself it was nothing. Just gossip. Just people making drama. Then her phone buzzed. She opened it to see her own face, frozen in a mocking smile, playing again and again across the screen. Comments flooded below, "Shameful. Disgrace. Hope she's proud." Her stomach dropped. She shoved the phone away, but the whispers around her grew louder in her mind. Across town, the video reached a veterans group. A retired Marine named Jackson watched it 3 times, his jaw tightening with each replay. He didn't know the black man in the video, but he knew the look in his eyes, the same look he carried after years of service, the weight of battles no one else could see. Jackson forwarded the clip to his network. Within minutes, it spread to other veteran pages, reaching hundreds, then thousands. By afternoon, the whispers had become voices. News reporters called the diner, asking for comments. Carlson's secretary answered the phone nervously, but Carlson waved her off. "It's just noise," he said. "People forget these things in a day." But people weren't forgetting. Outside the diner, small groups started gathering. Some came in silence, just to sit and watch. A man in a leather jacket, his arms covered in tattoos, parked his motorcycle across the street and sat on the curb, staring at the diner doors. Soon, more bikes rolled in, lining the block like a quiet wall. No one shouted. No one broke windows. They just waited. Inside, the waitress's hands shook as she poured coffee. The clink of the spoon against the cup felt too loud. Every glance from a customer burned into her skin. She wanted to laugh it off, but the laughter was gone. Only the echo of her own voice from last night haunted her. At the same time, in a small rented room across town, the veteran sat quietly. His duffel bag rested by the bed. His medals, still tucked inside, gleamed faintly when he unzipped the bag to check them. He wasn't looking at the video, wasn't scrolling through comments. He didn't need to. He had lived long enough to know that whispers carried their own power. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want chaos. He only wanted to move on. But the world around him had chosen to speak for him. By evening, the whispers turned into a storm. Local TV stations ran the story, "Veteran mocked in small-town diner." The clip played again and again, the waitress's laugh cutting through living rooms across the state. On social media, the diner's name trended. Reviews dropped to 1 star overnight. Strangers from other towns wrote, "Never eating there again." Carlson finally felt it when he walked into his diner that night and saw half the tables empty. The regulars were gone. Only silence sat in their place. Even those who did come and sat stiff, ordering nothing but water, eyes locked on the waitress. The sound of forks on plates was drowned out by the weight of judgment in the room. The waitress tried to keep working, but every step felt heavier. She dropped a plate, hands trembling, and the crash made the whole diner jump. Her face flushed red as people stared. For the first time, she realized her laugh had cost more than she thought. The day ended with rain tapping on the diner's windows. The neon sign flickered, weak against the storm. Carlson stood behind the counter, staring at his phone, scrolling through endless angry messages. His hands shook, not from age, but from the fear he never admitted before, fear that the whispers outside his walls had already become louder than his own voice. And somewhere in the dark, the video continued to spread, faster than the storm, faster than the rain. Tomorrow, the whispers would turn into something even bigger. Tomorrow, silence would not be enough. The next morning, the diner opened its doors as usual, but nothing about the day felt normal. The neon sign hummed weakly in the gray dawn, and rainwater still dripped from the roof after last night's storm. Inside, the smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, but the sound of laughter, the sound that once lived in every corner, was gone. Carlson, the owner, stood behind the counter, trying to convince himself that things would calm down. "It'll pass," he muttered as he wiped the same coffee pot for the third time. People forget. But the worry in his eyes betrayed him. He had seen the online reviews, the angry posts, the flood of phone calls. And yet, he told himself, surely folks wouldn't stop eating here over one small thing. He was wrong. By 8 o'clock, people began arriving. At first, Carlson thought it was a good sign, maybe business was coming back. A few men in leather jackets walked in, their boots heavy on the floor. They were big, broad-shouldered, with patches sewn onto their vests. Veterans. Bikers. The kind of men who spoke with their presence more than their mouths. They didn't order food. They didn't even ask for coffee. They simply sat down, filling 2 booths by the windows, their eyes quiet but sharp. Soon, more arrived. An older woman with silver hair, walking slowly with a cane, came inside and sat at the counter. She wore a faded army pin on her coat. Next came a group of younger men in baseball caps, each with shirts showing the names of military units. They too sat down without ordering. The waitress, the same one from that night, felt her throat tighten. Every time she approached a table and asked, "Can I get you something?" the answer was the same: silence. A shake of the head. A stare that burned without words. By mid-morning, the diner was full, but no one was eating. Plates stayed empty, coffee mugs untouched. The clinking of silverware was gone. In its place, a heavy, powerful silence filled the room. Carlson's nerves frayed. He stormed back into the kitchen, snapping at the cook. "Why aren't they ordering? We're not a waiting room, we're a diner." But the cook only shrugged, his face pale. Even he could feel it, this wasn't about food anymore. Outside, more people gathered. Dozens of motorcycles lined the street, their chrome shining under the sun. Neighbors came to watch, whispering among themselves. Some held up their phones, recording the scene, sending it to the world beyond the small town. Inside, the waitress tried to carry on. Her hands trembled as she wiped down a counter that didn't need wiping. Every time she looked up, she caught someone staring at her, someone who had seen the video, who had replayed her laughter 100 times. She wanted to speak, to explain, to say it wasn't that serious. But her voice stayed trapped in her throat. Then the news vans came. 2 white vans with satellite dishes pulled up outside, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones. They set up across the street, filming the diner, capturing every detail, the rows of bikers, the crowded booths filled with silent veterans, the tense faces inside. Carlson rushed outside, his hands raised. "This is private property," he barked. But the reporters ignored him, their cameras zooming in on the neon sign above the diner's door. They didn't need his permission. The story had already grown too large for him to control. By noon, the diner was packed shoulder to shoulder. More veterans arrived, some in uniform, some in street clothes, all carrying the same heavy silence. They filled every booth, every stool at the counter, even stood along the walls. Not one of them ate. Not one of them drank. The only sound was the hum of the ceiling fans and the scratch of pens as reporters outside took notes. It was not a protest in the loud, angry way. No chants. No shouting. No signs. It was something stronger, a protest made of silence. Silence that cut deeper than noise. The waitress couldn't stand it. Her hands shook so badly she dropped a tray of glasses, the shatter echoing like a gunshot. She gasped, her eyes wide, as the entire room turned to look at her. No one spoke. No one laughed. The silence that followed crushed her like a weight. She ran into the back room, her chest heaving. She pressed her hands over her face, but she could still hear it, the sound of her own laughter from that night, looping in her mind. She whispered to herself, it was just a joke, it was just a joke, but deep down, she knew it had never been just a joke. Back in the dining room, Carlson tried to salvage his pride. He clapped his hands, forcing a laugh. Come on, folks, what's all this about? You want to eat, then order. If not, then. But his voice faltered when one of the veterans finally stood up. He was tall, his hair gray, his hands scarred. He wore a faded uniform jacket, patches worn but still proud. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You disrespected one of ours. The words hung heavy in the air. Carlson opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The man sat back down, folding his arms. Silence returned, heavier than before. Outside, the cameras captured it all. The images would beam across television screens by evening, the story spreading even wider. The diner, once filled with laughter and chatter, had become a courtroom. And every person inside was a witness, a judge, a jury. The veteran who had been mocked wasn't even there. But his absence was louder than if he had walked through the door himself. His silence had called an army not of weapons, but of respect. And now the diner was on trial. While the diner filled with silence and judgment, another story began to rise in the town. It came not from cameras or headlines, but from whispers, from old photos taken out of drawers, from memories that some people had carried for years. The man they had seen mocked in that diner was not just a stranger passing through. He had a name. His name was David Miller. David had grown up in the same state, just a few towns over. People remembered him as the quiet kid who worked double shifts at the gas station to help his mother pay rent. He was polite, humble, never caused trouble. When he turned 18, he joined the army. Some remembered that day too, how he walked into the recruiter's office with his head high and his shoulders straight, carrying more determination than belongings. Years passed, and his story traveled farther than most of his neighbors could imagine. Afghanistan. Iraq. Peacekeeping missions. Long tours where nights stretched endless and days burned like fire. David became a soldier that others trusted with their lives. He wasn't the loud one, wasn't the one always talking. He was the steady one, the one who never left a man behind. In town, no one saw those battles. They only saw the short visits home, when David would sit quietly in the back of church, or stand respectfully during parades, his uniform pressed, his medals hidden beneath his jacket. He never bragged. He never asked for free meals or attention. He asked for only one thing, respect. But that night in the diner, respect was the one thing he didn't get. As the video spread, old friends began to speak up. A man named Harris, who had served with David overseas, posted a photo of them together in uniform. The caption read, "He carried me out of hell. That's who you laughed at." Another veteran wrote, "I watched him stand against fire so others could make it home. You owe him more than you know." The town listened. People who once stayed silent began to feel shame. The mother who sat with her son in the diner that night couldn't sleep. She remembered the way David had spoken, calm, steady, not angry. She remembered her own silence too, and it burned inside her. She told her husband the next morning, "We should have said something. We should have stood up." He nodded, but his face showed the same guilt. Even the two men in the booth that night admitted later to friends, "We froze. We should have spoken. But we didn't." The weight of their silence grew heavier with every story they read about David. Meanwhile, David himself stayed quiet. He rented a small room on the edge of town. Each morning, he rose early, laced his boots, and walked along the riverbank. He didn't chase the news, didn't follow the storm building around the diner. He had carried heavier storms in his life. Still, when he opened his duffel bag and looked at the medals inside, the memory of that laughter returned. Not because it hurt his pride, but because it showed how easy it was for people to forget the cost of peace. Back at the diner, Carlson began to realize this wasn't just an online scandal, it was a wound that reached into the heart of the community. An older man came in one evening, sat at the counter, and spoke to him directly. "Do you even know who that man was?" the old man asked. Carlson hesitated, then shook his head. The man leaned forward. "That was David Miller. He grew up here. He served 3 tours. And you let your waitress laugh at him." Then he walked out, leaving Carlson pale and shaken. The waitress too began to learn who she had mocked. Her phone was filled with messages now, not just angry strangers, but stories. Pictures of David in uniform. Articles about his service. Testimonials from soldiers who had fought beside him. Every new piece cut deeper into her chest. She had thought he was just another tired man with an old bag. She hadn't seen the weight of the years he carried. At night, she lay awake hearing her own laughter in her head. It used to feel powerful, a shield of pride. Now it sounded hollow, cruel, unforgivable. The town itself felt the same. Neighbors gathered on porches, talking in low voices about what had happened. "We all watched it," one woman said. "We all sat there and did nothing." Another man nodded, shame in his eyes. "We didn't defend him. Now the world is watching us." The past had risen to the surface, and it refused to be buried. In church on Sunday, the pastor spoke without naming names. He said, "Sometimes God sends us a test not to measure the one being mocked, but the ones who sit in silence." We failed that test. The congregation sat in heavy silence, some with tears, some unable to lift their eyes. But the one who remained most silent was David. He did not speak out, did not post, did not appear on TV. He let his past speak for him. His service, his sacrifices, his quiet dignity, those became louder than any words he could have spoken. And as the town wrestled with its guilt, the diner's fate grew darker. Because the more people learned about David's past, the less they could forgive the laughter that had tried to erase it. Tomorrow, that guilt would take its toll. Tomorrow, the diner's fall would begin. The week after the silence-filled protest, the diner was no longer the heart of the town. It had become a ghost of itself. Where once families filled booths and teenagers laughed over milkshakes, now only empty chairs and cold tables remained. The neon sign outside still glowed, but its light felt weak, like it was fighting against the darkness closing in. Carlson, the owner, stood in the doorway each morning, watching the street with desperate eyes. He told himself customers would return once the noise died down. "People move on," he whispered. "They always do." But every day, more of the town turned its back on him. The whispers hadn't faded, they had grown louder. The video of David Miller, the veteran mocked in his diner, was now everywhere. National news networks ran the story. Talk shows debated it. Hashtags calling for boycotts trended online. Review sites flooded with angry comments, "Never eating there again. Shameful. Close it down." The waitress tried to keep working, but her shifts were torture. The laughter she once used as a shield was gone. Now, when she walked into the diner, she felt stares from every passing car, every pedestrian. Parents pulled their children closer when she walked by. Friends stopped answering her calls. Even family avoided her. She had become the face of the laughter that shamed a veteran. One morning, Carlson called her into his office. He looked older than he had just a week ago, his face sagging with exhaustion. "I have no choice," he muttered. "You're fired." Her lips parted in shock. "Fired? After everything, I'm the only reason this place is still even open." Carlson slammed his hand on the desk. "You're the reason it's dying." His voice shook, not with anger alone but with fear. "You think people are staying away because of me? They're staying away because of you. Every time someone walks in here, they see your face from that video. They see your laugh. And they walk right back out." She wanted to argue, but deep down, she knew it was true. Her laugh had destroyed everything. She left the diner with tears in her eyes, clutching her apron like a funeral cloth. But firing her didn't save the diner. The next day, suppliers refused delivery. The bread truck didn't stop. The dairy company canceled their contract. Even the coffee distributor pulled out, their driver muttering, "Company policy. We can't be tied to this mess." Inside, food began to spoil. Milk turned sour. Meat rotted in the freezer. The smell of decay hung in the air. Carlson tried calling banks for help, but every call ended the same way: polite words, then rejection. No one wanted to invest in a business drowning in shame. And still, the veterans came. They didn't storm the diner anymore, they didn't need to. They simply stood across the street, their motorcycles parked in long rows, their arms crossed. They weren't loud. They weren't violent. They were reminders. Each day, more joined them. Each day, their silent presence told the whole town that respect was not optional. Customers who might have forgiven stayed away. Parents told their kids, "We don't eat there anymore." Workers on lunch break went to the cafe down the road instead. Even loyal regulars, people who had eaten at the diner for 20 years, stopped coming. One by one, chairs stayed empty, booths gathered dust, and the register rang less and less. Carlson tried discounts. He put up signs, family specials, half-off breakfasts. But nobody came. Money trickled out faster than it came in. Bills piled on his desk like a mountain, crushing him under their weight. At night, Carlson sat alone in the darkened diner, staring at the empty chairs. He remembered when the place was alive, when kids crowded booths after football games, when old couples shared pie, when laughter filled the walls. Now the only laughter that echoed in his mind was the waitress's cruel laugh from that night. One laugh that cost him everything. Finally, the day came when Carlson couldn't fight anymore. The bank sent a letter. His accounts were dry. The electricity bill went unpaid. One by one, the lights flickered out, leaving only the weak glow of the neon sign outside. That evening, Carlson walked to the front door with a heavy heart. In his hands, he held a simple cardboard sign. With slow fingers, he taped it to the glass, closed. Across the street, the veterans watched in silence. Their faces didn't show triumph or revenge, only solemn recognition. They didn't cheer when the sign went up. They didn't gloat. They simply nodded to one another. Respect had been defended. The waitress saw the sign too. She stood down the block, her hood pulled over her head, tears streaking her cheeks. The guilt inside her was heavier than any punishment the world could give. She whispered to herself, it was just a joke, but the empty diner in front of her proved otherwise. And that night, as the last lights went out inside, David Miller walked past. His boots were steady on the wet pavement, his duffel bag resting on his shoulder. He stopped for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He didn't celebrate. He only nodded once, quietly, as if closing a chapter. Then he turned and kept walking, fading into the night like a shadow carried by the wind. The diner that had laughed at him was gone. But his silence remained stronger than their laughter ever was. The diner stood dark and silent now. The once bright neon sign had gone out completely, leaving only a faint shadow on the glass where the word open used to glow. Weeds began to creep along the edges of the parking lot, and the booths inside gathered dust. What had once been the heart of the town's mornings was now a tomb, a quiet reminder of a single laugh that cost everything. But the town did not forget. Even after the diner's doors shut, people continued to talk about what happened there. At the grocery store, whispers turned into lessons parents told their children: you respect people. You never laugh at someone's pain. At church, the pastor spoke openly now: we are judged not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we treat the quiet ones who ask for nothing. And at schools, teachers reminded their students that kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can cost more than they can ever pay back. The waitress, the one who had mocked David Miller, tried to start fresh. She applied for jobs in other towns, but every time her name came up, the same question followed: aren't you the one from the video? Employers looked at her resume, then politely shook their heads. Strangers on the street recognized her face. Some ignored her, some looked away, others whispered behind her back. She had thought her laughter would make her feel powerful. Now, it had turned her into an outcast. She tried once to find David. She walked the streets where people said he stayed, hoping to apologize. She rehearsed the words in her head: I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't know who you were. But she never found him. David seemed to move like a shadow, here one moment, gone the next. Some said he had left town completely. Others said he was still around, just quiet, watching. Either way, he never came to the diner again. For David, silence had always been his armor. He didn't want cameras, didn't want speeches, didn't want the world to revolve around him. He had lived through things most people would never understand. A laugh from a waitress was small compared to what he had endured overseas. But what mattered wasn't just that laugh, it was the silence of those who let it happen. That was the wound that stayed. And yet, he chose dignity over anger. One evening, weeks after the diner closed, David sat alone at a small cafe on the far end of town. The place was simple: no neon signs, no long history, just clean tables and the smell of fresh coffee. When he walked in, the server greeted him with a smile, not fake, not mocking, just warm. She poured him coffee gently, setting it down without a spill. Anything else, sir? She asked softly. David shook his head. This is fine. Thank you. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Respect didn't need to be loud. It lived in small actions, in quiet gestures, in the way people looked at each other. For the first time since that night, David felt something ease in his chest. Back in town, the diner's building stood as a warning. Families passing by would point it out to their children. That's what happens when you forget respect, they'd say. No one painted over the boarded windows. No one took down the faded closed sign. It remained there like a scar, a reminder carved into the heart of the community. As for Carlson, the owner, he sold the property at a loss. He moved away, tired and bitter, still telling himself it wasn't fair. But deep down, he knew the truth: he had let disrespect live in his walls, and that choice had destroyed him. The waitress carried her guilt longer. Some nights, she would replay the video again and again, hearing her own laughter echo in the hollow rooms where she now stayed alone. No matter how many times she whispered, "It was just a joke," the truth answered back: it was never a joke to the man who had given everything for his country. And so, the story of David Miller became more than a scandal. It became a lesson. People didn't remember the diner for its pancakes or its coffee anymore. They remembered it as the place where a man's dignity stood taller than cruelty. They remembered how one veteran, with no anger in his voice and no army at his side, brought an entire town to its knees simply by refusing to answer hate with hate. Because in the end, his silence was louder than their laughter. The final memory the town carried was not of his hurt, nor of the laughter that mocked him, but of the quiet way he walked past the closed diner, pausing only for a second, giving it a single nod before moving on. A gesture that said more than revenge ever could. Respect, they realized, costs nothing. But without it, you can lose everything.